So in this video, we're going to learn how all those objections to Blaise Pascal's argument, Blaise has answers to, and we're going to see why everybody gets Pascal's wager wrong. Really, really wrong.
All right, let's see it.
If we think that Blaise Pascal was silly, that might not reflect on Blaise Pascal. That might be a sign that we have misunderstood him.
No one here thinks Pascal was silly. He was a genius in math and physics, and his contributions to probability theory and fluid dynamics speak for themselves. But being brilliant in one domain doesn't mean your ideas are above critique in another. Smart people can make bad arguments. Atheist scientists can be wrong about God. Theist scientists like Pascal can be wrong about God too. Regardless of how sharp Pascal was, his wager is still a poor apologetic argument, and I'll explain why.
Here is the first reason why people misunderstand Pascal's wager. They think Pascal is offering a reasoned argument for God. He's doing no such thing. He's in fact showing that reason does not get you to God.
That's partly accurate, but it leaves out a key point. Pascal does argue that reason alone can't settle the question of God's existence. For him, God is infinite, and finite minds like ours can't bridge the gap through logic. That's why he doesn't say we can know God by reason. Instead, he says, by faith we know his existence. So yes, he's not offering a proof of God, but he's offering a reasoned justification for belief, despite the lack of proof. And that's where the wager comes in. Pascal says, since you can't know for sure whether God exists, you should bet on belief anyway, because the potential reward is infinite. And if you are wrong, the potential loss is minimal. So it's not a proof for God. It's a strategic appeal to belief as if he exists. And here's where Glen misses the mark. He claims that critics like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins misunderstand Pascal. But no, they understand it perfectly. The wager only works if the Christian God is the right one. God rewards belief and punishes disbelief, and living as if he exists costs little. All of those are massive assumptions, and atheists do address them. They don't misunderstand the wager. They expose why it's a bad bet. Hello my friends, this is Shen from Mindful Living. Thanks for tuning in. This channel is all about thinking carefully, being mindful of what we believe, and how we come to those beliefs. I focus a lot on religion because it's one of those areas where people often lower their rational guard without realizing it. I'm not here to tell anyone to abandon religion, but I do believe we all want to become better thinkers. And if that resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe. Now here's the clip Glen Scrivener shows of Christopher Hitchens explaining Pascal's wager.
Look, what have you got to lose? Say you believe in God, and if he does exist, you have a chance of his favor. If you go ahead like this and say he doesn't, what if he does exist? You lose everything. That's it. I don't think I've condensed it in any unfair way.
Notice, Hitchens doesn't say that Pascal's wager is a proof that God exists. He understands perfectly that it's not about certainty, it's about a calculated risk, a pragmatic bet. And that's exactly what the wager is. You weigh the possibilities and decide that it is safer to believe in God because the payoff is eternal bliss. No proof, just risk management. So where is the misunderstanding? There isn't one. Hitchens' critique is that this makes God look absurd. The wager assumes that God would reward someone for hedging their bets, as if he's impressed by shallow cost-benefit analysis. But if such a God exists, wouldn't he see through that? Then Hitchens hits on another point. The wager assumes the audience is naive enough to fall for this logic. And frankly, he's not wrong. Plenty of people fall for shallow reasoning, just like people fall for email or telephone scams. You know the ones. Congratulations, you have won $10 million. Just send us a small fee to claim your prize. It's obviously ridiculous, but enough people take the bait that the scam keeps circulating. And that's why Pascal's wager is still being used today. Because for a certain type of person, someone feeling uncertain, fearful, or just looking for the safest emotional bet, it works. Not because it's a good argument, but because it's psychologically persuasive. But persuasion isn't the same thing as truth.
Human beings are heart-driven creatures who rationalize what we already love. What our hearts love our wills then choose, and our minds later justify. What the heart loves, the will chooses, the mind then justifies. And you already operate as somebody who is committed in this world because of your passions, not because of your reason. You haven't chosen your way into the life you now live. You have felt your way into the life that you now live.
Now, this might be what Pascal believed about human nature, and honestly, he's not entirely wrong. We do often start with what we want to be true and then build justifications around it. That's a real psychological insight. But here's the thing, it's not actually the point of the wager. So Glen can't fault atheists like Hitchens or Dawkins for not responding to this idea when they are critiquing the wager itself. Their critique is aimed at the structure and assumptions of the bet, not at Pascal's anthropology. But okay, let's pause the wager and think about this idea for a second. Yes, it's true that we often don't form our beliefs through reason. We form them from emotion, from social pressure, from personal needs, and then we rationalize after the fact. That happens. The question is, should we live this way? Should we let our desires dictate what we believe? Should we let our minds play the servants to our hearts, making up reasons for what we already want to be true? Or here's a radical idea, so brace yourself. Maybe we should use reason to test whether our passions are pointing us in the right direction. I know, shocking, right? I'm sure nobody's ever thought of that before. I hope you are taking notes because this might be the most groundbreaking idea you have heard all day. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just common sense. And I'm pretty sure Glen agrees with that too. So I'm not sure why this "we follow our heart" bit is supposed to flip the whole conversation. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. Yes, we are often irrational. That's true descriptively. But the goal shouldn't be to embrace that. The goal should be to challenge it, especially when it comes to something as consequential as belief in God. Now, here's what's really interesting about Glen's defense of Pascal's wager. He spends a good chunk of the video emphasizing that Pascal wasn't offering a rational proof of God, that humans are driven by their hearts, not their heads. But then he turns around and says this.
Well, look, if God exists, then you can wager on him and you win a lot. If God exists and you do not wager on him, you lose a lot. If God doesn't exist and you wager on him, you haven't lost that much really. Just a Sunday morning, no big loss. And if God doesn't exist and you haven't wagered on him, you haven't lost or won anything. So if you are being clever about it, if reason was dominating you the way you think it does, you would join me in church, wouldn't you? That's the argument of Pascal's wager. It's not the way Hitchens has portrayed it. It's not the way Dawkins has portrayed it.
Let's be clear. Glen is using reason here. He's making the classic cost-benefit case for why belief is the smarter bet. That is Pascal's wager in its traditional form. It's not just about following your heart. It's about using logic and expected return to justify belief. And guess what? This is the exact version that Hitchens and Dawkins responded to. Hitchens criticized the moral emptiness of believing in God just to hedge your bet. He said it makes God look like a fool who rewards insincere belief. Dawkins raised the obvious question, which God are we betting on? What if it's not Yahweh, but Allah, or Vishnu, or Odin? And what if the real God actually values honesty and punishes hypocritical belief? These aren't misunderstandings. They are direct responses to the very structure Glen just described. So when Glen says they all really misunderstand Pascal's wager, I think many of his more mindful viewers would see right through that. It's not that these critics don't get the argument, it's that they don't buy it. And rather than deal with those objections honestly, Glen uses hyperbole to suggest they are just missing the point, when really they have hit it head on. And honestly, that makes his video feel a little more like clickbait than serious engagement. And it's not just that. Let's go back to what Glen says earlier.
Here is the first reason why people misunderstand Pascal's wager. They think Pascal is offering a reasoned argument for God. He's doing no such thing. He's in fact showing that reason does not get you to God.
So according to Glen, Pascal isn't giving a rational argument for belief. He says the whole point is that reason cannot get you to God. But then just a few minutes later, Glen turns around and says this.
If reason was dominating you the way you think it does, you would join me in church, wouldn't you?
Wait, what? So is the wager not a reason argument for belief? Or is it exactly that? Because here, Glen is saying that if you were being rational, if reason were really in the driver's seat, you'd see that betting on God is the smarter move. So let's call it what it is. Pascal's wager is still a reason-based argument. And that's exactly what Hitchens, Dawkins, and many others are responding to. They are not confused. They are not misunderstanding Pascal. They are engaging with the claim that believing in God is the clever, rational bet. And they say rightly that it's not reasonable to bet on the Christian God. The argument assumes too much. It assumes that the Christian God exists, that he rewards belief and punishes doubt, that belief can be manufactured as a gamble, and that no other gods are worth betting on. I wish Glen would actually grapple with their objections instead of brushing them aside and declaring victory. He plays clips of them in the video, Hitchens, Dawkins, Alex O'Connor, and they state their case with clarity, but Glen just waves it off with, they got it wrong. But that's not the end of it. Glen doesn't just say reason will lead you to church. He also claims that atheists don't believe in God because they don't want to. Not because of logic, but because of personal passion.
At least get it into your head that it is not your reason that is leading you, it is your passions. It is your heart that is driving you, not your intelligence. Pascal is pointing out that the reason that his philosophical friends in the 17th century didn't go to church is because they didn't want to. And the reason that 21st century atheists don't go to church is because they don't want to. We consistently follow our hearts, not our heads. And the fact that you don't take Pascal's wager proves that you're not the rational person you thought you were.
Now, there's something partially true here. The idea that we follow our hearts and then use reason to justify what we already want is a real psychological insight. Jonathan Haidt explains this beautifully in his book, The Righteous Mind. It's well-researched and compelling, and I recommend the book. And yes, it's true that many atheists, just like many theists, don't arrive at their worldview through pure reason. There are emotional factors, social factors, and moral intuition at play here. We are human, after all. But here's the problem. This insight has nothing to do with Pascal's wager specifically. You can slap that line onto any apologetic argument. Say, the fine-tuned universe proves God, or the Bible is divinely inspired. And then if someone disagrees, just say, well, you must be rejecting it with your heart, not your reason. That's deflection. And that's what Glen is doing here. He assumes the wager is valid and then claims that if you still don't accept it, it must be because you are irrational or emotionally resistant. But that skips the most important question. Is the argument actually good? Because the reality is, atheists do push back on Pascal's wager. They raise serious, thoughtful objections. They challenge the assumptions, and Glen ignores those criticisms entirely. Instead of engaging, he reframes the issue. If you don't believe, it's not because the argument failed. It's because your heart got in the way. But even if an atheist is following their heart, that alone doesn't make their critique wrong. You can be emotionally motivated and still be right. These things aren't mutually exclusive. It can be true that someone feels inclined to reject belief in God, and also true that the arguments for God are unconvincing. Both can be true. One doesn't cancel out the other. So instead of assuming atheists are just dodging the truth, maybe we should ask, are theistic arguments actually valid in the first place? That's the question Glen avoids by shifting the blame to the heart. And here's something Glen doesn't seem to reflect on. If he's appealing to the idea that we all follow our hearts and not reason, then what about Christians? Isn't it just as true that many Christians believe in God because that's what their hearts tells them, not because they reasoned their way to it? If Glen wants to be consistent, he should admit that. Many Christians go to church because they want to. It's familiar. It brings comfort. It's meaningful to them. That doesn't make it wrong, but it also doesn't make it rational. But I'm not going to turn that into a knockdown argument against God. Just because someone believes in God without thinking it through doesn't mean God doesn't exist. That logic wouldn't follow. The same should go both ways. Which brings me to this next problem. If Glen really believes that people just follow their hearts, then what's the point of inviting non-Christians to try Christianity? What's the point of making a pitch at all? Because if everyone is just leaning into their own desires, Muslims, Hindus, and materialists, then isn't Glen supposed to say, "That's great, follow your heart. Let's see how he handles this"?
You might be a Muslim, you're leaning into certain Muslim accounts of the world, and that is shaping you in all sorts of ways. You might be a Hindu and you're leaning into that. You might be a materialist and just think that all of reality is just matter in motion. You're leaning into that already. And what Pascal is saying is be attentive to where your heart is already taking you. And instead of trying to think your way into a new way of living, why don't you live your way into a new way of thinking? Why not come along to church?
So after everything he said, after telling us that reason can't get us to God and the heart leads the way, his big invitation is, come to church anyway. Why? If people are already following their heart, and their heart has led them to Islam or Buddhism or secular humanism, then by Glen's logic, shouldn't he just leave them be? But no, he's still asking them to reposition their heart in a way that might make Christianity feel compelling. In other words, Glen is saying, try going to church, try reading the Bible, try living as if it's true, so that your heart might eventually want it. But by doing that, he's actually contradicting the whole premise he's been pushing throughout this video. If the heart is already in charge, and that's the end of story, why would anyone step out of their current belief system just to experiment with another one? He can't have it both ways. If belief is driven entirely by the heart, and we are already locked into our trajectories, then his invitation makes no sense. But if we can shift, if we can evaluate and reflect and change course, then reason does matter. And that opens the door right back to the criticisms of Pascal's wager that Glen spent the whole video trying to deflect.
You're always wagering. You are always putting skin in the game. And there is this one game with infinite blessing. Will you at least put yourself in the way of the gospel so that you can hear that gospel, experience that gospel, walk alongside others who will tell you that gospel?
So here it is, the emotional hook, the fear of missing out. You might not know if it's true, but don't risk missing out on infinite blessing. It's classic Pascal's wager, but this is exactly the part that many atheists critique. Because guess what? Muslims already believe they have infinite blessing through Islam. So do many Hindus, Mormons, and other religious traditions. So why should a devout Muslim stop going to mosque and instead go to Glen's church? Why doesn't Glen immerse himself in the culture and wisdom of Islam just to be safe, just to hedge his bets? Well, here's how Glen responds. This is the tweet he posted when I asked him the which God question, the most common and obvious challenge to Pascal's wager. The second sentence reads, on the which God point, you might, and Pascal does, have reasons for thinking the Christian God is significantly more likely than others. Now, think about that. After 20 minutes insisting that reason can't get you to God, that we're all driven by our hearts, Glen says, actually, we can have reasons for thinking the Christian God is more likely than others. So what is it? Is belief about passion or probability? If Glen believes that reason can tell us Christianity is significantly more likely, then he's making a reasoned argument for belief. He's saying that reason can direct you to the right God. That's the exact thing he said atheists misunderstand about the wager. But it turns out they didn't misunderstand. They understood it just fine and rejected it because it doesn't deal with the problem of competing religious claims. If Muslims also offer eternal paradise, if Hindus also offer spiritual liberation, then the math behind Pascal's wager collapses. The expected value calculation doesn't work anymore because the reward is promised by multiple, mutually exclusive systems. You can't use the wager to justify Christianity over Islam unless you already think Christianity is more likely. And now Glen is saying, well, maybe we do. But at that point, it's no longer Pascal's wager. He's bringing in other arguments for God to shore it up. And that's the tacit admission that the wager by itself is incomplete. It doesn't do the job Glen claims it does. If you need additional reasons to make the wager work, then the wager isn't working. And if those other arguments for God can actually demonstrate that the Christian God most likely exists, then we don't need the wager at all. It will be natural to accept the most probable option on its own merits. The wager becomes superfluous. In the end, there's nothing new, nothing surprising, just the same wager with the same flaws. Glen Scrivener's defense of Pascal's wager doesn't offer a new take. It just dresses up an old argument in new language. He says it's not about reason, but then relies on reason. He says we follow our hearts, but then urges us to override our current beliefs and experiment with church. He says atheists misunderstand the wager, but avoids engaging with their actual critiques. It's a rhetorical juggling act. And unfortunately, the contradictions are too obvious to ignore. If you want to believe in God, fine, but don't let fear of missing out or clever cost-benefit charts do the thinking for you. We owe it to ourselves to ask harder questions, to think more carefully, and resist the urge to take shortcuts, no matter how comforting they sound. If you found this video helpful, feel free to like, share, or leave a comment with your thoughts. I also have another video critiquing Glen's claim that atheists already believe in a resurrection. Tap on the screen if you are interested in that topic. Other than that, thank you for watching and see you in the next one.